Chapter 3. To Cross a Bridge. I was nearing 7 o'clock as Prue approached her house, and she could see the light on in the living room, and the silhouette of her mother's head, bowed over her knitting. Her father was nowhere in sight as she crept around the side of the house, moving slowly as to not disturb the pea gravel of the walk. The soggy blanket on the wagon made a convincing slumbering 1-year-old, but definitely wouldn't withstand close inspection. So Prue held her breath in hope that she wouldn't encounter an inquisitive parent. Her hopes were dashed as she rounded the back corner of the house and saw her dad fumbling with the garbage and recycling bins. The following day was garbage day. It had always been her father's task to wrestle the bins curbside. Seeing Prue, he wiped his hands together and said, "Hey, kiddo." The porch lights spread a hazy glow across the darkened lawn. "Hi, Dad," said Prue. Her heart was racing as she slowly walked the bike over to the side of the house and rested it against the wall. Her dad smiled. "You guys were out late. We were starting to wonder about you. You missed dinner, by the way." "We stopped at Proper Eats on the way in," said Prue. "Shared a stir-fry." She stepped awkwardly sideways as to stand between her dad and the wagon. She was painfully aware of her every movement as she tried to deny nonchalant. "How was your day, Dad?" "Oh, fine," he said. "Fairly hectic." He paused. "Get it? Craft fair, fairly hectic." Prue let out a loud, high-pitched laugh. She immediately second-guessed the reaction. Usually she groaned at her father's terrible puns. Her father seemed to notice the inconsistency as well. He cocked an eyebrow and asked, "How's Mac?" "He's great," Prue sputtered, maybe too quickly. "He's sleeping." "Really? That's early for him." He had a really active day. He ran around a lot, seemed pretty tuckered out, and so after we had food I just wrapped him in a blanket and he fell asleep." She smiled and gestured at the wagon behind her, just like that. Said her father. "Well, get him inside and into his jammies. He might be down for the count." He sighed, looked back at the recycling bins, and began dragging them along the side of the house towards the street. Prue let out a breath of relief. Turning around, she carefully scooped the wet blanket out of the wagon and walked into the house, bouncing and shushing the bundle as she went. The back door let into the kitchen, and Prue walked as softly as she could across the cork flooring. She had almost made it to the stairs when her mother called from the living room. "Prue, is that you?" Prue stopped and pressed the wet blanket against her chest. "Yes, Mother." "You guys missed dinner. How's Mac?" "Good. He's sleeping. We ate on the way home." "Sleeping?" she asked, and Prue could imagine her bespectacled face turning to look at the clock on the mantel. "Oh, I guess get him in jammies," Prue finished for her. "I'm on it." She tore upstairs, skipping every other step, and rushed into her room, dumping the soaked blanket in her dirty clothes hamper. Then she walked out into the hall and headed to Mac's room. She grabbed one of his stuffed animals, an owl, and placed it in his crib, carefully shrouding the toy with blankets. Satisfied with the lump at a glance which suggested a sleeping baby, she nodded to herself and turned off the light, then headed back into her room. She closed the door and threw herself onto the bed. Burying her head in her pillows. Her heart was still beating wildly, and it took several moments to get her breath under control. The rain made quite a rattle against the glass of her window. Prue lifted her head from the bed and looked around her room. Downstairs she could hear her father shutting the outside door behind him and walking into the living room. The shushed murmur of her parents' voices followed, and Prue rolled out of bed and set about preparing for tomorrow's adventure. Pulling her messenger bag from beneath her desk, she upended it and dumped everything out onto the floor. Her science book, spiral notebook, a clutch of ballpoint pens. She grabbed the flashlight she kept under her bed and took the Swiss Army knife her dad had bought her for her 12th birthday from her desk drawer and stuck them in the bottom of the bag. She stood for a moment in the middle of her room and chewed on her fingernail. What did one pack for a trip into the impossible wilderness to retrieve one's brother? She would get food from the pantry in the morning. For now, all she needed to do was wait. She thumped back down on her bed, pulled the Sibling Guide to Birds from inside her petticoat, and flipped the pages, trying to clear her mind of the frantic thoughts that were racing through her head. After an hour or so, she heard her parents walk up the stairs, and her heart started pounding again. There was a knock at her door. She said, again feeling nonchalance. She didn't know how much longer she'd be able to keep this act up. All this nonchalance, finagling, it was exhausting work. Her dad cracked the door and peeked in. "Good night, sweetheart," he said. Her mother added, "Don't be up too late." "Mm-hmm," said Prue. She turned and smiled at them, and they closed the door. Prue frowned as she heard their footsteps on the hardwood floor moving toward her brother's room. The sound of Mac's door creaking open sounded like a peal of thunder to Prue's hyper-attentive ears, and her breath caught in her throat. Thinking quickly, Prue leapt from her bed and ran to her door, peeking her head out from around the jamb. "Hey, Mom, Dad," she whispered loudly. "What's that?" said her father, his hand on the doorknob. The light from Mac's nightlight spilled into the hallway. "I think he's really wiped out. Maybe try not to wake him." Her mother smiled and nodded. "Sure thing," she said before poking her head into Mac's room and saying quietly, "Good night, Mackie." "Sweet dreams," whispered her father. The door creaked shut, and Prue smiled at her parents as they passed her on the way to their bedroom. Seeing the door close behind them, she returned to her bed and let out a breath. It emerged from her chest as if she'd held it in all day long. That night, Prue slept restlessly, her sleep fraught with dreams of great flocks of giant birds, owls, eagles, and ravens, in dazzling plumage, swooping down and carrying away her father and mother and leaving Prue alone in their emptied house. She had set her alarm for 5 a.m., but had been awake for a while when it finally went off. She rolled out of bed, carefully not to make too much noise. The house was silent. The world was still dark outside, and the neighborhood had yet to wake up, the only sound being the occasional car whispering past the house. Prue slipped into her jeans and threw on a shirt and a sweater. Her petticoat was still draped over her desk chair from the night before, and she clenched a scarf around her neck before putting on the coat. She wriggled her feet into her black sneakers and padded out into the hall. She put her ear to her parents' door and listened for the sawing snore of her father. Her parents were fast asleep. She figured she had an hour before they woke up, or they would be up, which would be plenty of time to make her escape. She walked down to her brother's room and pulled the stuffed animal from his crib and upset the blankets. She picked a set of warm clothes from Mac's red chest of drawers and stuffed them into her messenger bag. Tiptoeing downstairs, Prue wrote a hasty note on the dry erase board by the fridge. "Mom, Dad, Mac was up early, wanted to go adventuring. Back later. Love, Prue." She opened the pantry and puzzled over the potential rations she might bring along, settling on a handful of granola bars and a bag of gorp left over from the summer's last camping trip. By the camping staples was the family's emergency first aid kit, and Prue slipped the plastic case into her bag, and an air horn, a kind of canister with a plastic belled horn on the top, caught her attention, and she picked it up, inspecting it. A picture of a menacing grizzly bear graced the label. The word "Bear be gone" made an arc in an air above him. Apparently, the noise was loud enough to scare away wildlife, something she imagined would come in handy in an impossible wilderness. She dropped it into the messenger bag and scanned the kitchen before slipping out the back door to the yard. The air was brittle and cold, and the slight breeze disturbed the yellowing leaves in the oak trees. Prue pushed her bike, the radio fly wagon still attached, quietly out into the street. The first glimmers of dawn could be seen to the distant east, but the streetlights still illuminated the leafy sidewalks as Prue pushed her bike a safe distance from her house before climbing on. The scarf her mother had knit for her the prior winter clung snugly to her neck as she gained speed over the pavement. Heading southwest through the streets and alleys, lights on the houses began flickering on, and the hum of the cars on the streets grew as the neighborhood awoke to the morning. Following the path of her pursuit the day before, Prue made her way through the park to the bluff, the wagon jumping and clattering behind her. A heavy mist hung over the river basin, obscuring the water completely. The lights of the waste on the far banks of the river flashed under the cloud. An inscrutable clanking noise was carried across the wide trough of the river, echoing off the cliff walls of the bluff. It sounded to Prue like the grinding gears of a giant's wristwatch. The only thing beyond the bluff was exposed above the bank of clouds was the imposing iron lattice of the railroad bridge. It seemed to float, unmourned on the river must. Prue dismounted her bike and walked it south along the bluff toward the area where the cliff side sloped down into the clouds. The world around her dimmed to white as she descended. When the ground below Prue's feet finally evened out, she found she was standing in an alien landscape. The mist clung to everything, casting the world in a ghostly sheen. A slight wind was buffeting through the gorge, and the mist occasionally shifted to reveal the distant shapes of indecisive wind-blown trees. The ground was covered in a dead yellow grass. Just beyond a line of trees, a span of railroad tracks carved a straight line east to west, disappearing into the haze on either side. Assuming the tracks would lead over the bridge, Prue began following them westward. Ahead, the mist lifted, and she could see the spires of the railroad bridge as she made her way toward it. She suddenly heard the sound of footsteps in the gravel behind her. She froze. After a moment, she cautiously looked over her shoulder. There was no one there. She had turned and kept walking when she heard the sound again. "Who's there?" she shouted, searching the area behind her. There was no response. The railroad tracks, flanked by the line of strange, squat trees, disappeared into the mist. There was no sign of a pursuer. Prue took a deep shuddering breath, and began walking faster towards the bridge. Suddenly, the footsteps sounded again unmistakably, and she spun around in time to see a figure dart off the tracks and through a gap between two of the trees. Without thinking, she dropped her bike to the ground and gave chase, her shoes sending up a small plum of gravel as she took the corner into the trees. "Stop!" she yelled. She could now see the person through the mist. He was rather short and wore a heavy winter coat, a stocking cap pulled down over the figure's head, obscuring his face. When Prue yelled, the person momentarily looked behind him and slipped in a patch of loose dirt, slamming shoulder fist into the ground with a hoarse yell of surprise. Prue dove onto the prostrate form of her pursuer and yanked the figure's stocking cap away. She gave a startled cry. "Curtis!" she yelled. "Hi, Prue," said Curtis out of breath. He squirmed underneath her. "Can you get off of me? Your knee is really pushing into my stomach." "No way," said Prue, regaining her composure. "Not till you tell me why you were following me," Curtis sighed. Wasn't really." She jammed her knee further into his ribs, and Curtis let out a cry. Okay, he shouted, his voice quavering on the edge of crying. "I was up early taking recycling out, and I happened to see you riding by. I just wondered where you were going. I heard you talking to yourself last night about your brother and how you were going to get him, and then I saw you leave your house so early this morning, and I figured something had to be up, and I just couldn't help myself." "What do you know about my brother?" Prue asked. "Nothing," said Curtis, sniffling. "I just know he's missing." He blushed a little. "Also, I don't know who you were trying to fool with that wet blanket in the wagon." Prue released the pressure on his ribs, and Curtis let out a breath of air. "You scared the crap out of me," said Prue. She stepped off his body, and Curtis sat up, dusting off his pants. "Sorry, Prue," said Curtis. "I didn't really mean anything by it. I was just curious." "Well, don't be," said Prue. She stood up, began to walk away. "This is none of your business. This is my mess to deal with." Curtis scrambled to his feet. "Let me come with you," he shouted, following after her. Back at the railroad tracks, Prue pulled her bike up from the gravel and started walking it toward the bridge. "No, Curtis," she said. "Go home." The riverbank sloped in toward the first abutment of the bridge, creating a kind of peninsula, and the track followed a gentle slope to meet the lattice of the bridge. Prue led her bike up the middle of the tracks while she balanced on the rail. As she climbed, the mist began to clear to reveal the first spire of the bridge. The spires housed the pulley mechanism that lifted the middle section when taller boats crossed under it, and they were topped with flashing red beacons. Prue breathed a sigh of relief to see that the lift span was down, allowing her to cross. "Aren't you worried that a train's going to come?" asked Curtis behind her. "No," said Prue, though in truth it was one thing she hadn't really considered. Between the track and the truss of the bridge there was barely 3 feet of space, and the loose gravel was not too friendly to pedestrian traffic. As she arrived at the middle section of the bridge, she looked over the edge and gulped. The mist sat heavily on the river basin and created a floor of clouds that hid the water below, giving the illusion that the bridge sat at a tremendous height, like one of those delicate rope bridges spanning from cloudy persuasive chasm. Prue had seen the National Graphic magazine. I'm a little worried that a train's going to come, admitted Curtis. He was standing beneath one of the spiles in the middle of the track. Prue stopped, leaned her bike against the bridge truss, and picked up a rock from the gravel bed. Don't make me do this, Curtis, she said. Do what? Prue threw the rocks, and Curtis leapt out of the way, nearly tripping on the rail of the track. What'd you do that for? He yelled, crouching his head in his hands. 'Cause you're being stupid, and you're following me, and I told you not to, that's why. She bent down and selected another rock, this one sharper and bigger than the previous one. She juggled it in her hand as if gauging the weight. Come on, Prue, Curtis said. Let me help you. I'm a good helper. My dad was den leader of my cousin's Weblow's group. He let his hands fall from his head. I even brought my cousin's Bowie knife. He patted the pocket of his coat and smiled sheepishly. Prue threw the second rock and swore as it glanced off the ground in front of Curtis, missing his feet by inches. Curtis yelled and danced out of the way. Go home, Curtis, Prue shouted. She crouched down and selected another rock, but paused as she felt the ground give a sudden terrible bellow, a sudden tremble below her.